Thank you, Elise, for the introduction. And I also want to thank the Reuben for inviting me to speak at this wonderful series, and to all of you for coming on this Mother's Day weekend. As an art historian and a specialist of art, Buddhist art in China and Himalayas, I first was introduced to my area of study through visits to Reuben as a student. And so over the years, I've owed much of my education to the Reubens. Exhibitions, publications, and conferences. In fact, a really exceptionally beautiful cover and of my book, please, I apologize for not being more modest, but the cover is very beautiful, came from the Reuben. And so it's an honor for me to be a part of this ongoing conversation. So today I would like to introduce the relationship. Let me see. I think this projector will go on sometime, right? Okay, thank you. I would like to introduce the relationship between Tibetan Buddhist Lamas and the Qing court through the lens of the people who were instrumental in shaping this relation. And so those included the successive emperors of China of the last dynasty, imperial dynasty in China, as well as the successive Dalai Lamas and Panchen Lamas, who were at this period during the Qing dynasty, the most powerful Tibetan Lamas in Tibet. And so by thinking about how to look at this relationship through their own lenses, I will be focusing especially from a sort of material and visual perspective. So their meetings and exchanges were, in fact, very carefully portrayed by both sides, by the Tibetan Lamas, by the Qing emperors, and by their court artists. And both parties also engaged in this very sumptuous exchange of gifts. And those gifts were often exchanged for the very purpose of better defining this relationship. So throughout this lecture today, we'll be looking at what that relationship was like through these portrayals of their meetings, as well as the set of a certain selection of objects that went back between the two, between the Qing court and the Tibetan Lamas. So to begin, I think the premise of this lecture series is on the fact that pre-modern relationships between Tibet and China was based on terms very different from Western or modern notions of nationhood, sovereignty, also these categories of politics and religion. And so I think that we have to sort of, this is also one of the reasons why it's helpful to think about these things through the objects that were made during that time. And in terms of trying to understand this relationship, I think two of the most important and interrelated concepts that were most fundamental, that were sort of underpinned this reality, this relationship, are first, the understanding of a Tibetan Reincarnate Lama, and second, the understanding of a so-called priest and patron relationship. We might have touched on these earlier in the lecture series, but I would like to go through these two kind of concepts briefly at the beginning here. So that of a Tibetan Reincarnate Lama, known in Tibetan as Chou, is someone who is regarded as an earthly emanation of a transcendent bodhisattva, a deity, a Buddhist deity, and who has the ability to voluntarily take rebirth in this world to help others on the path of liberation. And I think this is an understanding that clearly continues today with the current 14th Dalai Lama. Even though His Holiness has officially stepped down from his position as the sort of temporal and spiritual leader of Tibet, the majority of Tibetans today and many others still perceive him both as an emanation of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, who is the Buddhist deity of compassion, and as the sort of absolute ruler, protector of the Tibetan land. This very, I think, deep-seated belief that in the Dalai Lama as both the religious and worldly sovereign through the identification of him with Avalokiteshvara originated in the 17th century and began with the fifth Dalai Lama, who's portrayed here on the left in this gold tanka from the Reuben, just really beautiful, which is upstairs in the exhibit in Faith and Empire. And you can see him in this portrayal as a monk holding a stem of a lotus blossom, the attributes of the deity Avalokiteshvara. And moreover, he's also surrounded by his previous incarnations. Most importantly, the Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva himself, at the very top. Let me see if I can. Right here. And these other figures all around him are portraying his previous incarnations as deities, as kings, previous figures. And on the right here, you can see this is a section of a wall painting from the Portrayal Palace in Lhasa, which is the home of the Dalai Lama and the seat of the Tibetan government. In this particular section of his long, lengthy biography that covered the entire sort of stretch of the wall here and the sort of lower portion of the hall, the fifth Dalai Lama appears in the form of a 1,000-armed, 1,000-eyed Avalokiteshvara. And all of this, either appearing as a monk with attributes of Avalokiteshvara as seen on the left, or as this deity himself, are ways of reinforcing his identity as a bodhisattva incarnate. And the fifth Dalai Lama was the first person to become the unified religious and political authority of Tibet after the Mongol Gushui Khan conquered Tibet and ritually offered it to the fifth. His reign was so sort of extraordinary in various different ways that he became known as the Great Fifth. It was during his reign that we see more peace, prosperity, and this kind of flourishing culture, a flourishing of culture and scholarly knowledge. And his school, his religious school, the Gaelic school, though it was one of the last to be established in Tibet, rose to become a monopolizing force in a state religion through the strategies, the sort of very strategies of promoting reincarnation system and rallying support from wealthy external patrons. So this relationship between the fifth Dalai Lama and his Mongol patron Gushui Khan, which in fact follows this very illustrious precedent between Tibetans and Mongols, the model that was created by Kublai Khan and Pakpa Lodro Gyaltsen in the 13th century, was known as the priest-patron relationship. And that is the second operative concept that we're coming to. So this idea that the priest offered the patron, who is often a state ruler, religious teachings, spiritual guidance, and then in return for material and political, which is most often military protection. And this protection would also allow the religious schools to increase their number of disciples and also increase their power and their wealth. And so these two key concepts here, one of this kind of bodhisattva, deity emanation, reincarnate lama, and second of this kind of so-called priest and patron relationship are very, well, as we'll see throughout this lecture, very important in determining this kind of shared reality that existed between the Qing court on the one hand and the courts of the Tibetan Lamas on the other. And what I would like to do today is to think about how these concepts, which already date back to the 13th century with the Mongols and the Tibetans, how they are sort of expanded and modified and sort of perpetuated through this period of the Qing dynasty from the 17th century to the early 20th century. So around the same time, in the middle of the 17th century, when the fifth Dalai Lama was building his institution and consolidating his power, a semi-agricultural group of Jurchens from the north side of the Great Wall in Northeast Asia, they conquered China, and they are the ones who founded the Qing dynasty. They also renamed themselves as the Manchus. So the Manchu Qings is what I'll be referring to. And shortly after the young Manchu emperor, Shunzhi, settled into the capital in Beijing, he invited the fifth Dalai Lama to his court. And because the fifth Dalai Lama had enjoyed the position as a sort of chief spiritual authority among the Mongols, it was important for the newly established Qing to present themselves as the new patron protector of the Gaelic school of the Dalai Lamas. So in a sense, they're presenting themselves to the Tibetans as the new Mongols, and in fact, also in competition with the Mongols. So here is a wall painting. I don't know how well you can see. The images themselves aren't, with the heavy varnish, aren't great to begin with. Wonderful paintings nonetheless. So this is another part of the same wall painting that documents the biography of the fifth Dalai Lama in the Red Palace of the Potala. And it depicts this celebrated meeting between the fifth Dalai Lama on the left-hand side, see, and the Qing Shunzhi emperor on the right, and their meeting is housed in this great hall inside the forbidden city, the Taihe hall. So you can see here some very interesting details. See closer up. You can see how the Dalai Lama here is shown in a gesture of prayer on the one hand, and on the other hand holding a jeweled wheel of law. And this jeweled wheel of law is the one that symbolizes his status as a so-called Chakravartin, this Indian model of a universal monarch who turns the wheel of law as both the worldly ruler and also one whose rule supports the pursuit of Buddhist teachings. And so you can see on the right-hand side, the Manchu emperor is depicted in his courtly attire. And both of them are just ever so slightly turned toward each other so that we can see they're in conversation with one another. Now, I could spend a whole lecture just talking about this image, but I feel a few key things to note is the height of the thrones. And the eventual height of the two figures. You can see how the Qing emperor here is depicted on a slightly higher throne, yet the Dalai Lama, because his pointed hat, which is a very important hat that symbolizes scholarly learning, it's kind of a pandita hat, tops it off just a little bit, so to have them eventually be equal in height to one another. And another kind of very interesting, so I think, again, these depictions are very carefully calibrated in thinking about what the relationship, what the status is all sort of visualized here. If you go back to also looking at the larger image here, another very interesting thing to note is this kind of understanding, the Tibetan portrayal of the Forbidden Palace. You can see on the left-hand side, it's the Forbidden Palace in Beijing. The satellite pictures of it exists a decade or two ago, just how it appears now. And on the right is this painting that seeks to portray it. Again, if you just notice what differences, what transformations, still we have this recognition that this is a Qing palace. But this palace that was in the Chinese tradition here, one that is really, in terms of architecture, it's all about axial symmetry, right? So the temples would go, the halls would go in this central axis here, and the halls go one after another successively. And it's central axis that's the sort of main focus of this kind of imperial architecture. You have one major gate here, the Tiananmen Square, and followed by a gate, and then there's another gate in the back. There are some side gates, but really the main thing is this kind of central axis. Now, if we go back to looking at the murals here, this central axial construction of the Forbidden Palace is turned into something that perhaps we're a little bit more familiar here at the Reuben, like a mandala, yes? And so you have something that is turning into some sort of idealized universe, an Indian palace. Here you can see how the mandala is often square in shape, rather than here, very obviously, you have this kind of rectangular shape. And a mandala would have usually 4 gates from the 4 sides. You can see them kind of being depicted here. And in addition, instead of having a sort of imperial Chinese palace where the most important halls are sort of on the axis towards the back, like any Chinese architecture, the most important aspects of the mandala is the center where the deity resides. And so in many ways, this is a very interesting already Tibetan understanding of a take of what the Forbidden Palace was like. And this is significant. The visit came after the 5th Dalai Lama had earlier recognized the Qing dynastic founder, Hong Taiji, as an emanation of Manchus, who is the Bodhisattva of wisdom. And so this is a Dalai Lama who's recognized himself as a reincarnation or emanation of Avalokiteshvara, now recognizing the Qing emperors as an emanation of the other major bodhisattva within the Buddhist and also Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And both the appellation of this kind of Manjushri as the emperor's title and the visit were in many ways unprecedented, yet within this kind of Tibetan pictorial and textual narrative, it was also seen as fulfilling a prophecy that was made earlier, this prophecy that a secular incarnation of Manjushri would eventually come to unite China, Mongolia, and Tibet, and therefore confirming this kind of universal sovereignty of a newly consolidated Manchu power. On a different stretch, so here I just wanted to show you one more. This is a tanka, a later tanka of a medicine Buddha at the Ruben. You can see how this palace is kind of ambivalently looking like a mandala. So in a different stretch of the same palace, same mural series, we have a painting that depicts a temple in Beijing called the Yellow Temple. And this is the temple that was built directly north of the Forbidden Palace and built especially to house the visit of the 5th Dalai Lama, who had journeyed to Beijing overland from Mongolia. And in the process of this long, arduous journey, as you can see here, also incurred a lot of stuff. And so this, this mural takes great attention, great pains to depict the various gifts of silk brocades, offerings of food, finely embossed metal vessels here. You can see ewers, gold coins, all sorts of other coral. You can see somewhere here. All these other precious offerings that were given to the Dalai Lama. But also, I think what is exchanged, what is understood within this gifts exchange also goes far beyond what can be represented here through the sort of sheer quantity and diversity of things. There are many other things that were considered gifts. Oh, you can see here some more details. Here's a giant coral. There were also other things that were exchanged. Gifts of teachings, scriptures, gifts of empowerments, initiations, transmissions. We also have gifts of appellations, honorary titles. For example, the 5th Dalai Lama, in return from having given the Qing emperors the title of a Manjugosha emperor, received the title, quote, Dalai Lama, overseer of the Buddhist faith and on earth under the great benevolent self-existent Buddha of the Western paradise. That's end of quote. That's his gift of honorary title appellation. There's also gifts of sacred images, and they're often done in mass quantities and often done in conjunction with birthday celebrations as well. There's also gifts of palaces, feasts, and hospitality. So this is a pattern, right? So the temple that was built for the 5th would be not the only one. Later visits would also be housed in special temples, in very lavish temples that were built for these other later visitors, as well as see. There's also gifts of art objects, money and fine goods, and so on. So the relationship that was established between Shunzhi and the 5th Dalai Lama dependent on this mutual recognition of the successive Dalai Lamas as the emanation of Avalokiteshvara, and Manchu emperors as those of Manchuria came to define the relations between Tibet and China. And indeed, the Qing expansion into and management of Inner Asia in the next 2 centuries. Until the early 20th century, the Manchu rulers of the Qing Emperor, who were variously interested in maintaining stability over the vast frontiers of their territories, and who were also themselves practitioners of Tibetan Buddhism and sought spiritual help from Tibetan Buddhist teachers, all of them aligned themselves with the successive Dalai Lamas, and as well as those of the Dalai Lama's spiritual teachers, known as the Panchen Lamas. And they had their own court, a state court in the city of Shigatse, west of Lhasa. In a recent study of this dynamic, the historian Peter Schwieger concluded that, quote, the dominance of the Qing court over Tibet was based entirely on the Tibetan institution of reincarnation, end of quote. I think visual materials produced by the Dalai Lama's court and by the Qing court tell that same story. And among all the Manchu emperors, it was Shunzhi's great-grandson, the Qianlong emperor, portrayed here in his court, in official court portrait. It was Qianlong who most creatively explored and exploited the possibilities of these specific identities of reincarnate lamas and of the relations between the patron and priest. It was also under Qianlong that the Qing expanded to its greatest territorial extent to include much of Tibet, Central Asia, and Mongolia. This is just a rough map of the comparison of what was the territorial extent of the Ming versus the territorial extent of the Qing that was established under Qianlong. Though often through violent means, Qianlong's management of Tibet was always conducted through measured relations with their main allies and channels of control, the courts of the Dalai Lamas and Panchen Lamas. So, and also, very importantly, virtually all of this kind of back and forth between Qianlong, between Qianlong and the Tibetan Lamas in Tibet were conducted under the advice of Qianlong's boyhood friend, also his guru, his advisor, the eminent Gaelic reincarnate Lama, Zhangjia Ropei Dorje. Zhangjia was the incarnation of a Lama who was a teacher to both Qianlong's father and grandfather, the two previous Manchu emperors, Yongzheng and Kangxi. And so when the Qing forces destroyed the home monastery of this Lama in eastern Tibet during an uprising, they had a specific instruction to spare the life of this young reincarnate Lama, who then became Zhangjia, and bring him to Beijing. And as a result, Zhangjia was educated in the Qing court along with the prince who became Qianlong emperor. And I think also importantly to note is that Zhangjia was not Tibetan. He was Mongol, which is a group of Mongols who settled in eastern Tibet in the 13th century. And in fact, until this day, they have maintained their own distinct language. And they were historically, especially during the Qing, very important in mediating relationships between China, Tibet, and Mongolia. So Zhangjia became, as sort of brought up in the Qing court, he became a Qing religious state preceptor and was the chief translator. He knew the 4 languages, Manchu, Mongolian, Tibetan, and Chinese impeccably. So a translator, he was also an iconographer, was an architect, and a diplomatic liaison of all things Buddhist and Inner Asia, the Qing court. Within the Gaelic monastic world, he also became a highly revered teacher, scholar, polymath. And this is a portrait of him that was done in the court posthumously. I think the extent to which Qianlong, in collaboration with Zhangjia, went to push the understanding of the deity incarnation and also patron-priest relations is probably best attested to in this particular gift of Qianlong's portrait to Tibet. In the year 1757, Qianlong dispatched Zhangjia as a Qing imperial emissary to central Tibet to oversee the transition of power in the wake of the seventh Dalai Lama's death. And in the sort of caravan, he sent this portrait along with other objects to Tibet. with this delegation. Now, as you can see, in this tanka, and this is the central portion of it, Qianlong appears as none other than an ordained Gaelic monk himself, with wearing a pandita's hat and this kind of golden monastic robe, multi-layered. He also appears as a Chakravartin. We've seen this earlier, that this is the same wheel of law that the fifth Dalai Lama held in that mural in the Portrayal. So again, simple sort of gesturing toward the fact that he's also a sort of a wheel-turning king. He's also represented, importantly, with this sword and a book above his two shoulders as an emanation of Manchus. And he's sitting here in the center of a vast spiritual pantheon in this Buddhist paradise-like landscape. And along with this image, Qianlong also sent explicit instructions that the portrait tanka serve as a surrogate for making pilgrimages to the sacred images of Tibet, and as well as for receiving veneration, both from lay and monastic communities. I think this tanka seems to have functioned accordingly. So when the 8th Dalai Lama came of age, he initiated routine ritual offerings in front of it. So at this point, we have to, I think, ask, what business does an emperor have in portraying himself as an ordained incarnate monk of the Gaelic school? What is the message here? So instead of saying to the Dalai Lama, I'm your devoted patron protector, it's as though the image is saying, I'm just like you, but even more supremely so. How could that possibly go over well? And how did an emperor's portrait become this kind of locus of Gaelic Buddhist devotion? We already know that the Gaelic Buddhists refer to the Qing emperors as emanations of Manchus. This goes back all the way to the time of the 5th Dalai Lama and the Qing founding emperors. Yet the Qianlong tanka portraits, I think, went beyond this notion of divine kingship. And so this is a question that I've been researching on in conjunction with the Faith and Empire exhibit. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time here thinking about that with you as well. So the tanka is not just a one-off, but at least 7 other ones were once displayed in the major monasteries of Beijing, Inner Mongolia, and Tibet. Here are the 6 other extant versions. In my view, the success of such a portrait as a kind of how it became a devotional icon rests on this very careful formulation of multiple pictorial genres and traditions that were familiar to their makers and audiences, and that they were also understood to be powerful or efficacious. And these various genres and traditions include liturgically prescribed images, paintings of deity mandalas, transmissions, lineages, Buddhist paradises, as well as European Baroque portraiture. The results are images that display, on the one hand, a very deep investment in the ritual power of objects in Tibetan Buddhism, and on the other, a playful and appalling reworking of Tibetan Buddhist forms. So to illustrate this manipulation that I'm trying to, I would like to elucidate it with one of these kind of comparison with one of these comparable genres that the painting is referring to. And so you can see here, on the right-hand side is a tanka, also at the Ruben Museum of Art. It's a painting genre within Tibetan paintings called Refuge field paintings. And they are used within the Tibetan Buddhist meditative and liturgical context of paying devotion to one's teachers. Between the Qianlong tanka on the left, here you can see this tanka here is one of the other 7 versions, not the one from the Portrayal, but you can see that I think I'm showing it here to show how similar visually they can be. And so you can immediately observe this similarity in which this kind of numerous smaller figures are arranged around the larger central figure. They're grouped in this loosely circular formation with additional groups above and below. Between the 2 compositions, we even find many similar figures. You have like Nagarjuna, these Buddhist philosophers. They appear in both of these paintings. Now, just looking for a second at this image here of a refuge field paintings. Such paintings, and this whole genre of paintings, there are a number of them. Even at the Rubin, we have a pretty good collection. They pictorialize what a practitioner, a Buddhist practitioner, is instructed to visualize in a devotional practice known in Tibetan as Lama Tripa, or teacher veneration. And much like the sort of mandala paintings of mandalas, these paintings can variously function as a reminder of or an expression of the practice of meditative visualization. The composition of this painting is based on a 17th century Lama Tripa liturgy by the 4th Panchen Lama, a text that has been widely adopted as the standard textual prescription for the preliminary ritual devotion to one's guru, or root teacher, at the beginning of a tantric meditation practice. So as a part of this longer liturgy of Lama Tripa, when the practitioner imagines all of one's spiritual teachers, past masters and deities in this vivid detail, generating their idealized world and invites them to all come to this world. At that point, the practitioner visualizes the teacher and deity the deities dissolving into the guru, who eventually come to one's own heart through the crown of one's head. This visualization practice can be understood as a kind of gift exchange. So by paying devotion and receiving blessing from one's guru, the practitioner merges with the teacher through ritual veneration. I'll just quote a few lines from this liturgy to give you a sense of what is being pictorialized here. In the vast sky of indivisible bliss and emptiness, clouds of Samantabhadra's offering gather. In their center is a wish-granting tree adorned with leaves, fruit, and flowers. At the top, the lions is a throne of blazing jewels, on which is a vast lotus, sun, and moon. My guru, endowed with 3 kindnesses, sits there. In essence, he is all the Buddhas, in one aspect, a saffron-clad monk, with one face, I'm a little fast, with one face, 2 arms, and a radiant smile. His right hand is in the gesture of teaching and doctrine, his left in the gesture of meditation, holds a begging bowl filled with ambrosia. He wears 3 robes the color of saffron, a yellow pandita's hat adorns his head. In his heart sits the pervasive master Vajradhara with one face, 2 arms, and a blue-colored body. Holding a vajra and a bell, he embraces his consort Vajradhatu Ishvari. End of quote. This text goes on to describe in detail this envisioned universe around one's guru. I think very significantly, in this tanka, these elements are all pictorialized. You can sort of follow the text here, but they're also pictorialized with a lot of specificity. Teachers, deities, and protectors that are otherwise unspecified in the liturgical text. They're unspecified purposefully because everybody has different teachers and different gurus. But in the tanka, they're now identified through their iconographic features and inscriptions. So a lot of figures down here have text, and also with the iconography, you can tell who they are. So in a sense, the painting, different from the text, become a kind of lineage map. And it also indexes this decisive role of the guru for one's practice within Tibetan Buddhism. The guru is the source of all teachings, the singular conduit between practitioner and practice. Contrary to the Zen Buddhist rhetoric of immediacy, this is a kind of unapologetic claim of a mediated practice. All teachings and deities begin first and foremost with one's own guru in the center, through whom and through whom only is enlightenment possible. So the guru in the central position in this tanka is Tsongkhapa, the 14th century founder of the Gaelic school. By the end of the 17th century, the Gaelic school had not only become, through the building of the 5th Dalai Lama, the largest religio-political entity in Tibet, but also one religious school that promised the more orthodoxy and uniformity of ritual and curriculum than any other religious groups in Chinese or Tibetan across China and in Asia. And within the Gaelic curriculum, Lama Tripa is the most universally practiced liturgy for every member of its entire community who wants to then go on to do other visualizations and practices. The image was therefore the single most important representation of the universal authority of Gaelic Buddhism at the time, and this is a fact that Qianlong was no doubt aware of. So now if we return to the Qianlong Tankas, the image of Tsongkhapa that we see here in the middle is now replaced with Qianlong. Here's another more famous one from this collection from the Freer Gallery. And you can see here in this, zooming in here, the efficacy of this kind of Tibetan Buddhist visual lexicon isn't actually the only one that is being co-opted here. To enhance the sort of immediacy of the emperor's presence in this cosmic order, Qianlong employed his favorite court painter, the Milanese Jesuit Giuseppe Castiglione, who rendered the precise physiognomy of his face in a suppressed modeling technique drawn from the painter's training in Baroque realism. The rest of the composition was painted by Tibetan Buddhist monks in the imperial palace, the same painters who were responsible for the production of Buddhist images at the Qing court. So if the tanka is assumed to function in the same way as a kind of pictorial, as the refuge field paintings, right, a pictorial reminder of Lama Tripa, it would then imply that Qianlong is now the envisioned guru in this new refuge field. After all, it is through the alliance with the Gaelic school that the Qing emperors ultimately brought Tibet into its fold. Qianlong's replacement of, or more precisely, conflation with the Gaelic patriarch through this veristic appearance as an ordained monk in the iconography of Tsongkhapa, it seems all too purposeful. Yet to read the Qianlong tankas as evidence that the emperor was himself visualized as a guru, and that these tankas were in fact used for ritual veneration of him, as some have suggested, would be to simplify the Qing pictorial and liturgical intervention, and to undermine the liberty with which the Qianlong emperor and his court appropriated images, identity, and practices. And this is something that he was very famously doing, not just in terms of Tibetan objects, but all through all things of the empire. Therefore, I think in fact, the earliest extant refuge field paintings date to the same period as when the Qianlong tankas were produced, around mid to late 18th century. So it's more likely that just as the envisioned world of a refuge field was being expressed and codified in their pictorial material form, the Qing seized the opportunity to insert the emperor's image into this cosmological representation. And so one major difference between the Qianlong tankas and the extant examples of refuge field paintings is the prominence of Qianlong's guru, which you can see here appearing above Qianlong's head. Zhang Jia appears consistently in every one of them in this very prominent position in all of the tankas. You can see here as well, there again, Zhang Jia appears. With Qianlong's guru Zhang Jia featured prominently in his own enclosed rondo directly above Qianlong, the tanka tilts the pictorial perspective from that of an envisioned universe to one that combines multiple viewpoints, and therefore also one can think of multiple subjectivities. So there's Qianlong, who's a guru, he can sort of see him, can be seen as seen as a center, right, a source of teachings. But we can also see Qianlong himself as the subject who envisions his teacher, his guru, Zhang Jia atop his head. Further, the presumed viewer practitioner of this visualization witnesses the interdependent and indivisible teacher discipleship. Right? So this is interesting, thinking about this priest-patron relationship, which is operative here as well. But here it's this indivisible teacher discipleship that now mediates the spiritual universe. If the refuge field paintings index the centrality of the guru in one's religious practice, analogously, the Qianlong tankas index the emperor's extraordinary reliance on his Buddhist teacher, Zhang Jia, throughout the latter's life and service at the court. The bond between the emperor and his Buddhist teacher is now at the center of this kind of cosmo-political order, where both of them are as crucial to the flourishing of the Gaelic school as its founder, Tsongkhapa. This shifting of subjectivity is also at the very heart of the practice of Lama Tripa. The longer liturgy, in fact, it's a tantric liturgy, because it opens with the practitioner imagining and declaring oneself to be a teacher deity or the Buddha. The visualization of the refuge field comes after the practitioner is transformed into Buddhahood. The spiritual universe of one's visualization eventually dissolves into oneself by way of one's guru. In a similar way, the Qianlong Tankas compel us to go back and forth, right, between Qianlong, his guru Zhangjia above, and Manjugosha. Manjushri or Manjugosha, same different names for the same deity. So the ability to take the place and perspective of another in this visual or visionary world is thus the premise of ritual transformation in Lama Tripa, and also underscored by the play of perspectives and subjectivities in these tankas as well. And so this very kind of understanding observation also led me to find yet an eighth tanka shown on the left. I won't go into detail here, but basically, if you can see at first glance, they look very similar, correct? But if you look carefully, you will be able to recognize that the central figure of the tanka on the left is not Qianlong. It's in fact his guru, Zhangjia, who is recognizable by this characteristic lump that he had on his right cheek. And you can see that in various extant paintings of him. And there's also a lot of other clues. The figures appear in similar gestures, attires, thrones. But while Qianlong holds kind of a chakravartin wheel, Zhangjia holds a long life vase. And the figures around them are also very different. He has different attributes than Qianlong. Qianlong has the attributes of Manjushri, the deity of wisdom, whereas Zhangjia has the attributes of belt and vajra, which is that of his personal meditation deity, Chakrasambhara. And whereas Qianlong is on the right is framed with this very hefty ornate throne, or thrown back. Zhangjia on the left is surrounded by the same type of aureole that appears in refuge field paintings, kind of emitting light rather than a piece of furniture. And as we saw earlier, in the Qianlong Tankas, Zhangjia, right, appeared in this kind of very chief position, but in the Zhangjia Tanka, the corresponding position is replaced by Tsongkhapa and his two chief disciples. And because of that, because Tsongkhapa appears on the top, within this lotus, within this kind of garland of figures on the Qianlong Tanka, and because he had gone up there, they had to also insert two additional figures in the lineage to kind of make up, to reshuffle the figures around. Everything else remains the same, but for these little changes. The visual parallels and similarities between the two complicates what is already a fraught image-making practice. On the one hand, since Zhangjia was Qianlong's guru, this tanka on the left, this eighth tanka, unlike the 7 other ones portraying Qianlong, which we can't really imagine it functioning within a liturgical context, unlike those, this one is plausible as a pictorialization of what Qianlong and other students of Zhangjia would have visualized in their daily devotions. That is, it could have been conceivably serving as a pictorial aid for Lama Tripa. On the other hand, the affinity between Zhangjia and Qianlong Tanka was also quite bold for an imperial workshop production, signaling an unprecedented equation between emperor and lama. After all, Lama Tripa is an exchange between teacher and disciple. Offerings given, blessings received, which is aimed at dissolving the teacher-student, subject-object binary. By the same token, the double portrayal of Zhangjia and Qianlong as a focal point of devotional practice repositioned the visionary perspective of refuge field paintings by pictorializing not only the envisioned lineage and pantheon, but also the playful fluidity with which the roles of deities and practitioners, teachers, disciples, patrons, lamas, shift and merge. Now, just returning briefly to the gift Qianlong gave to the future Dalai Lama, as unexpected as it must have been to see the Qing emperor materialize through European Baroque-inspired realism at the center of a Tibetan Buddhist spiritual genealogy, it is important to remember that the visionary world of teachers generated by a practitioner's imaginative capacities would have been equally varied and in fact subject to individual experience. So when giving this gift, Qianlong and Zhang Jia no doubt, I think, understood the fluid nature of visions and the fact that when you pictorialize and materialize this vision, that you can also tailor and reify its authority. So I think this awareness of the flexibility of ritual, of identity, and of how images function was not something that belonged to Qianlong and Zhang Jia alone, but that was something that was in fact shared by the courts of the Dalai Lama and that of their teacher, the Panchen Lamas. And so with that, I would like to move into thinking about what the Dalai Lamas gave to the Qing court in return with the gifts that were like this that were brought to Portrayal. Among the most defining gifts sent to the Qing court turns out to be tankas of the Dalai Lamas and Panchen Lamas' respective rebirth lineages, as shown here. This painting is a whole set, so I'm showing you the extant paintings that now in the Palace Museum of this whole set of 13. And the first set was sent to Beijing by the regent of the 8th Dalai Lama in 1761, a year before the young Dalai Lama was enthroned. The set depicts the prominent previous lives of the Dalai Lama, from bodhisattvas to Indian sages to prominent Tibetan kings and scholars of all sects. And this is in part to show the sort of Gaelic origin and incorporation of all Buddhist teachings. It is a way not to only define their current sovereignty over Tibet, but their ancestral hold over Tibet and the Buddhist world. These paintings do so many things, and they reveal the genealogy of specific transmissions of teachings and successions of rebirth. And they would be, and you can show here, this is a painting from a different temple, a different sect altogether, but you could just get a sense of how they would have been hung in the sort of very central assembly hall of any monastery, and when you're just below the skylight, so you could see them all visualized in the whole lineage as though they're congregating around and participating in the assembly. So they're in a way, so in other words, they're not never shown in series, but they're shown kind of as a panorama. So they would be hung in temples, I think, I'm trying to think of a comparison. I think nowadays, if we want to give people a sense of our biography or professional identity, something like a biography, right, or a professional seeking a sort of CV, right, so where we've taught, what we have achieved, where we got our degrees from. Here, if this is a kind of equivalent of a CV, it stretches back to the time of the historical Buddha. So painting, and then also imagine trying to paint this kind of highly beautiful pictorialized CV that goes all the way back, that goes back to all of your previous lives over the past 2,000 years, and then send it as a present to someone. Okay, so here are just some details here. We don't have a whole lot of time, but I want to go through them so you can get a sense of that image of this kind of compounded, layered identity that was so well understood and so well cultivated. We have Avalokiteshvara, both he's emanating Dalai Lama. Dalai Lama is emanating him, but he's also kind of understood to be the beginning of the series. And then we have Indian kings. We also have, very importantly, Tibetan kings, Tibetan dynastic rulers, right? So part of that genealogy, other important lamas, Lama Dromtongpa, who are all understood variously to be previous lives of the Dalai Lama. So Kunga Ningpo, these from different sects, the Sakya sect, the Kadamba sect, and then eventually to the first Dalai Lama, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. So that's the way this lineage works. So as a gift, I think the question is, what does it achieve? Through this kind of veritable connection back to India, through dynastic Tibet, we have ideas portrayed here of lineage, identity, and legitimacy. I think during the time of the 5th Dalai Lama in the 17th century, it was still not clear whether he was the sort of sole legitimate ruler of Tibet. But by the 18th century, I think this institution had already been firmly established. Even though, ironically, the successive Dalai Lamas after the fifth rarely held any actual power. Most of them, in fact, didn't live to their majority. But I think it was exactly during this time when they were considered the nominal center of Gaelic institution and of Tibet that all these energies went into maintaining their identity, their central authority in the middle of in Gelugpa institution and in Tibet. And now, as for how these gifts were received, apparently Qianlong loved them. And he loved them so much that he had them copied. And this is something he did when he was appreciated and recognized something new and novel and that he really liked, he would copy them. And he used the copies to adorn this incredible architectural replica of the Portrayal Palace that he built in 1771 to celebrate his own birthday, the birthday of his mother, as well as the return of the allegiance of the Mongols from Russia. And this palace is built in the imperial summer retreat of Chengde or Zhehou. The building itself can be seen as a sort of gift, right, an homage to the Dalai Lama, all while asserting the Qing imperial reach over Tibet. This celebration, and so here you can see the sort of interesting, we're calling it replica, Qianlong was calling it replica, but you can see how they're, in a way, they're different, but in very kind of visual terms, they're echoing back to which this is the Portrayal Palace itself. So this celebration that took place inside a Portrayal replica, on the right is this kind of partial view of this central hall, Chinese style, wrapped around in this kind of shell of what looks like a Tibetan temple. And on the left is this painting that commemorated this event of a celebration of the return of this group of Mongols. And it was made jointly by the Jesuit painter from Bohemia, Ignatius Sichelpart, a Chinese painter, Yao Wenhan, and other artists in the Qing court. Like the Qianlong tankas, this painting almost so demonstrates this kind of very interesting exchange and combination of perspectives. The dialogue between the emperor and his Tibetan Buddhist teachers is no longer shown in this kind of mandalic arrangement that we saw earlier in the meeting between the fifth Dalai Lama and Shunzhi. But there's still very important ways to express the very utterly transcendent nature of this meeting that is being depicted. The auspicious clouds on top, right? The use of an approximate single point perspective to highlight the central position of the emperor here, right? Everything sort of goes in the middle there, points to the middle there, as well as the emphasis on connection to heaven. Which expresses this kind of mandate of heavenly rule within this Confucian tradition. These are all elements that are come together here in this painting. Continuing then on with for this exact same location that was portrayed in the painting, the sixth Panchen Lama had also sent a series of 12 tankas to Qianlong. And you can see, and this is the sixth Panchen Lama, who I'll talk about in a bit, and you can see them, the extant paintings here. And the Panchen Lamas are, as I mentioned earlier, they're the scholarly religious teachers of the Dalai Lamas. And their rebirth lineage tankas correspondingly compare with the Dalai Lamas, have less kings and more scholars. And so you can see some details here. Here is going back to the chief disciple of the Buddha, Subhuti. Here is another king of the mythical kingdom of Shambhala. Here is an Indian scholar, Bhaviveka, another Indian tantric master, Abhaya Karagupta. This is a translator, Lotsawa. Here is Sakya Pandita. And so various important figures in different schools, and more chiefly teacher practitioner than ruler king. Okay, and So this set, Qianlong loved probably even more so. And so he just, if you go through the court documents, he had them endlessly reproduced in different medias, in tanka paintings, in ink engravings, in album leaves, you name it. And they're still just all there in Qing court. And so you can see, I like this comparison here. On the right is one of the very large-scale replicas that was a replica of this set, apparently. And it's much larger, but it's interesting to think about, in this process of copying, what changed and what stays the same. And you can see here that in this painting here, this copy that they made, that were used to decorate something. We'll talk decorate another palace that Qianlong had built for the Panchen himself. You can see the details here. We're still seeing the same Indian teacher, but there's elements of traditional Chinese landscape painting, traditional Chinese garden settings. All these details were very creatively changed or added in comparison, from this kind of earlier version that was received from Tibet. Now, this is the very temple that Qianlong had built for the Panchen Lama, and it is a copy of the Panchen Lama's seat called the Tashi Lumpo Monastery in Tibet. And so the sixth Panchen Lama, who had been invited over the course of the years many times to Tibet, finally, to China, finally accepted Qianlong's invitation to visit in 1780. And this was an ill-fated visit, since the Panchen Lama contracted smallpox and died soon after he arrived in Beijing. And this is the reason, really, why most Tibetan Lamas hesitate to travel to Beijing, because none of them have any exposure to smallpox. However, the sixth Panchen's tragic death was masked by this grand narrative of a much larger sense of life, one that contains countless past and future lives. And I think we already see a little bit of that. And it is an example of this larger sense of life. When the Panchen Lama, you just kind of stay with me, so it gets a little tedious, but when he visited Qianlong, one of the most important gift he gave to Qianlong as a birthday present when he met Qianlong was a praise poem, or kind of a prayer. And what was the prayer for? It was a prayer, supplication, a praise towards Qianlong's own previous incarnations. And all of these previous incarnations, you may have guessed, are in one way or another closely connected with the previous lives of the Panchen Lamas that are depicted in the paintings. And this gift was, in fact, materialized in a Qing production shown here, attesting to, I think, how well it would have been received by the emperor. I mean, you have to think this is not anyone, this is the emperor. So to kind of say, here, I'm giving you a praise poem, I'm going to name who you were in all your past lives, right? And apparently it was well received enough that the Qing court had made an album, a textual pictorial album to go with it. And the album has Tibetan, Manchu, Mongolian, Chinese on the one side, written in gold on black. On the other side, these tanka paintings. This is the last one, has Qianlong as Manjushri. But it goes through. It's very interesting thinking about who these figures are that are being attributed as Qianlong previous lives. I won't go into too much detail, but I think more importantly, and not coincidentally as well, the Qing court had produced other albums, at least 2 other albums. And who would they have been? The kind of question, right? I think the answer is fairly straightforward. Here is Zhang Jia and his previous incarnations. And again, all of these previous incarnations in some way or another interconnected. I talk a little bit more about this in my essay in the Faith and Empire exhibit that I won't go into. But basically, just to say here with the slide showing, these albums are not only narrating a kind of profound, they're not only narrating what a great figure this is through these illustrious past lives, but also what a profoundly deep karmic relations the Qing emperor had with his lamas, going all the way back to the beginning of Buddhism. And even more importantly, I think, what that past indicates is how their future, this relationship is destined to continue. So I think in that sense of life, right, in that sense of time span, it's all, the sort of death, the tragic death, the Panchen Lama can almost be sort of thought of in very different terms, because that's, the connection is going to continue. So that's, those are the albums. And then moving on, so we've talked around this very sort of the first two visits, the visit in 1653 by the 5th Dalai Lama, the visit in 1780 by the 6th Panchen Lama, one at the beginning of the Qing, one in the height of the empire. And then I want to just end my lecture with the last meeting that happened during the Qing dynasty, that happened at the very end of the Qing in 1908, which is a meeting between the 13th Dalai Lama and the Empress Dowager Cixi and Guangxu. So this is a portrait of the 13th Dalai Lama. And he is the only Dalai Lama of all Dalai Lama who, after the 5th, was given this title of the Great 13th. So there's a Great 5th, and then there's a Great 13th for all that he did. And he fled Lhasa in 1904 from the British young husband invasion. And when he fled Lhasa, he first went northwestward in search of protection from Tsarist Russia. And that fell through largely because of Sino-Japanese War. He then, at that point, turned southward toward Mongolia, China. And he turned toward the Qing, and he arrived in Beijing in 1908. So this was a rather compromised, sort of less than glamorous circumstances. He was fleeing from the British. He had nowhere to turn. He was sort of stuck there with with this kind of fell food promise from Russia. He basically had no choice but to go to the Qing court. And nonetheless, this journey was told and understood in the Tibetan sources as this kind of grand pilgrimage, where he went to places to spread the teachings of Buddhism in places that most needed them. And this narrative works. So you can see here, this is a scene which came from the mausoleum of the 13th that was built 1933, 1935. This is a scene which depicts the 13th arrival in Beijing, which is complete with the sort of pageantry of guns, cannons, and motorcades. And here's another detail here, which is his meeting with Empress Dowager Cixi. The Dalai Lama is shown presenting a gift of a jeweled wheel of law. It's, again, we see this jeweled wheel of law. It has to appear, and how does it appear? This is a good question. To Empress Dowager Cixi, in a way, still hoping that he would be she would continue her role as a kind of protector, right? And then turn towards Cixi in this three-quarter view. His figure is, again, ever so slightly lower than Cixi. But again, I don't know if you can see very well, this image just washes out, but his pointed hat, again, saves the day by rising slightly above Cixi's floral headdress. So their meeting, again, it really, I think for any of us, anyone who's seen these other images, it echoes the visit of the 5th Dalai Lama to Beijing, also in the sort of return of the Turkic Mongols in this Qing commissioned painting of this kind of courtly meetings. And so in a way, because it's adopted various different modes of representation, in a way, it also sort of added all these elements of so-called modernity in there to kind of keep timely with the sort of practices of the time. But at the same time, it's still very much sort of acting and referring to these precedents. And the entire biography, in fact, of the 13th culminates in this final image of the Dalai Lama as a Avalokiteshvara, in this very seamless transition between his political identity as duties. He's going around, this is different parts of Beijing. He was touring, visiting. This is when he was in Mongolia. And so these pictured on the peripheries of the main icon are his various activities, and then in the center, as the divine, all-knowing, thousand-armed, thousand-eyed deity. Again, echoing very well this final image of the biography, in the biography of the fifth Dalai Lama in the Red Palace of the Portrayal. So in conclusion, what we've seen, gifts are meaningful in establishing relations and identities, and contemporaneous narratives from the perspective of court historians, pictorial or textual, tell us a lot about just how these relations were perceived and how they worked. Emperors of the Qing are known as some of the most serious practitioners of Tibetan Buddhism. And precisely because of their familiarity with or proximity to the tradition, they also exploited it to the greatest extent. As for the Tibetan Lamas, it's equally important, I think, to recognize through what we've seen today that narrative of spiritual and worldly kinship was in fact maintained during this period of great sectarian rivalry within Tibet and throughout their period of incorporation into the Qing Empire. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that interesting deep dive. We have a little bit of time now for some questions. Would anyone like to get started?
I'm not sure if you just referred to what my question is about anyway, but I knew a Chinese fellow who came from Beijing, and this is about 10 years ago, and he's a lawyer here. And he was very open-minded about a lot of things, but he was very adamant that Tibet belonged to China. And he said, and it had to do with, he said that there was a ruler in the past that had, a Tibetan ruler that had ceded Tibet to China, and therefore Tibet belongs to China. Mm-hmm. So do you want to comment on that at all?
Oh, yes, I can. I don't need the mic. It'd be interesting to find out more about who he thinks this ruler was, right? So, I obviously can't answer that, but I think one of the narratives that can be construed is that, yes, we have these Tibetan Lamas, including the 5th Dalai Lama, including the 6th Panchen Lama, including in some sense the 13th Dalai Lama, who went to the Qing court. From the perspective of the Qing, it's a way of saying they've come to accept or to pay tribute. In a way, it's not paying tribute, but it can be construed as this like, paying homage, celebrating my birthday with me. So I think those figures can be construed within that narrative. But also you have also in the Mongol Yuan dynasty, also you have Tibetan Lamas who had also come to the Qing, the Mongol court, and the Ming too. They have also come to the Ming court. And in all of these cases, you have different stories coming from two ends. One can have, from the Tibetan perspective, they're doing their necessary duty to spread the Buddhist Dharma. So in some ways, they're trying to benefit the sort of areas that are now known as China. So I think definitely.
Do they speak the same language?
Who?
These two, the Tibetans and the Chinese, do they have a mutual language?
Well, that's the interesting, no, they don't. They don't, they would have to go through a translator. And so then very importantly, the Manchus' national language was not Chinese. And I think that's another important thing that's kind of also in terms of, it becomes ideological too. Do we call do we think of the Manchus as Chinese? Do we think of them as, in a way they came to China with, this is a part that I haven't talked about, but in many ways, they needed to legitimize themselves as so-called Chinese rulers, and in terms of taking up the mandate of heaven in this kind of traditional Confucian, quote-unquote, Chinese sense of rulership. And so they did practice all their bureaucracy, and their sort of all their practices were continuing on the sort of Ming dynasty foundation and the precedents. So they did, so it depends on what you're defining, what this fellow wants to define.
Whatever the government is telling him.
Well.
Whatever the Chinese government is saying.
So, but I think maybe the thing is to think about, so that narrative is very, how that narrative is constructed. And so in a way, what we're looking at, the paintings here are also what the Tibetan government and the Chinese government at the time were telling, right? So that continues, yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
early on you said about the attacking the monastery.
Yes.
They attacked the monastery. I mean,
Yes. Yeah.
Could you
yes.
elaborate on that? It sounds awful.
Yes. Yeah. This was not just the one incident, but throughout the 18th century, there were various uprisings, and a lot of times the monasteries, because they have a large number of young men, would be enlisted to help them fight in the war. In fact, they had no choice. They had to basically choose which side they supported between any kind of conflict between two sides. And in this case, the monastery that Zhang Jia came from sided with the uprising Mongols, the group of Mongols, and because of that, the monastery was completely destroyed. And there were many other instances. This was a very violent times, and so there were So that's what happened.
Thank you. Any final questions here before we wrap up?
Thanks so much for this great talk and for these wonderful images. I have a really simple question. This is the first time I've seen that Freer image so clearly. And I noticed for the first time ever that Qianlong is holding a tiny piece of string. And I'd just like to know, could you tell me what that piece of iconography is?
If I can get to it. It's a string, I believe it's the stem of the lotus. Oh, yeah, I think that's what it is. Yeah, so it's connected. Do you see it's connected, it's the stem, it's connected to the lotus.
What happens on the other side? It just goes into the
Right. Good question. Oh, you think that? Oh, right. So no, this is the first time seeing. You mean it's going up here, right? Yeah. I've always thought of it as stem of lotus, but it could be something else. I've seen it because I've seen certain things, but not this kind of string. And I think you're onto something. That's.
He was just doing like a standard mudra always.
Right. He is doing that, but right. Yeah, I would love to see if there are. I'm going to check now with all the other tankas to see if they're there. Thanks for.
Great, thank you. And for those, oh, sorry, do you have a question?
I'm sorry, I'm not too knowledgeable. What is happening with the Tibet and the Dalai Lama? Is there a new Dalai Lama? What is going on for Tibet?
I think it's, so right now, the current His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama is alive and well. So I think there is a lot of discussion and debate and speculations of what's going to happen when he passes. But for now, he is the Dalai Lama. Yeah.
Get a mic to you there in the back.
Hi. Knowing a little bit about the Mongolian history and how they defended like the Uyghur people from the Chinese suppression of the faith of their Islamic practice, and how the Tibetan Lamas kind of courted both the Mongol Empire and the Chinese Empire at the same time. Did that create any kind of problems for them and like the Islamic people of the minority regions in China, or like the fringes of the Tibetan Empire, like between the Mongols and themselves and also the Chinese?
Thank you for that really good question. I think we know a little bit more about the situation in the 20th century, early 20th century, but I'm not personally as knowledgeable about that. I think your speaker from last week would have been able to answer that question perfectly, Professor Johan Alverskog, who has sort of been thinking exactly the questions you're asking. It would be interesting to delve more into the archives and the sources and to think how these different relations are managed and tensions. Yeah. So thank you for the question. I'm sorry I can't give you a more concrete example of what that's like. Yeah.